You know the moment. Something small breaks. Not dramatic, not catastrophic, just inconvenient. A light comes on in your car. A strange sound you haven't heard before. A bill that's a little higher than usual. You notice it. You feel that tightness in your chest. And then you do what most people do. You ignore it. Not because you're careless, not because you're irresponsible, but because fixing it right now feels impossible. You tell yourself it can wait. You tell yourself it's probably nothing. You tell yourself you'll deal with it next week, next paycheck, next month. And somehow it always waits. Until it doesn't. Until the small thing becomes expensive. Embarrassingly expensive. Life-alteringly expensive. And what's strange is this. You don't see this pattern once. You see it everywhere. The car, the bank, the grocery store, rent, fees, late charges, interest. It's like the moment you fall even slightly behind, everything around you starts charging more. Not gradually, immediately. Before we go any further, this is Donki. If you want calm, honest explanations about money, you're in the right place. Let's stay with that feeling for a moment. That quiet panic, that sense that you're working, trying, staying afloat. Yet somehow everything costs more than it should. You've probably been told why. You've heard the explanations. Budget better. Spend less. Be disciplined. Make smarter choices. But if that were really the answer, this wouldn't feel so consistent. This wouldn't happen to people who are trying. It wouldn't repeat itself with such mechanical precision. And that's the part that doesn't quite make sense, because this doesn't feel like chaos. It feels patterned, predictable, almost mathematical. Think about how often the most expensive problems in your life started as the cheapest ones. A repair you delayed, a bill you couldn't quite cover, a purchase you made because it was the only option available at the time. Each decision felt small, reasonable, justified. And yet, months later, you're staring at a number that feels completely disconnected from the original problem. That's not bad luck. Luck is random. This isn't random. It happens too reliably. Across different people, different cities, different incomes. Which raises an uncomfortable question. Why does being short on money seem to make everything else more expensive? Not harder, not stressful, more expensive. Let's take something ordinary, something boring, something nobody thinks too deeply about. Shoes, not fashion shoes, not luxury shoes, work shoes, the kind you wear because you have to. If you have enough money, you buy a good pair once. They cost more up front, sure, but they last. You don't think about them much after that. If you don't have that money, you buy the cheap pair. They work for a while. Then the sole wears down. The stitching gives up. Water starts seeping in. So you replace them. Again and again. Nothing about this feels like a mistake. You didn't choose the cheap pair because you wanted to. You chose it because it was the only pair you could afford in that moment. But over time, you notice something strange. You've spent more, not just a little more, sometimes double, and you still don't have good shoes. That pattern shows up everywhere once you start noticing it. Groceries. If you have room in your budget, you buy in bulk. Lower price per unit, fewer trips, less stress. If you don't, you buy what you can afford right now. Smaller quantities, higher prices, more frequent trips. You're not buying luxury items, you're buying survival. But somehow, survival costs more per unit. Then there's the bank. This one hurts because it feels personal. If you keep a healthy balance, the bank is polite, quiet, almost invisible. No fees, no warnings, no problems. The moment your balance drops too low, the tone changes. A subscription hits. Before your paycheck clears, a charge goes through at the wrong time. Suddenly, there's a fee. Not a small one. A punishment-sized one. And what's strange is how quickly this escalates. A few dollars short turns into dozens of dollars gone. Not because you borrowed a lot, but because you borrowed while broke. That distinction matters because it shows up again and again. Cars. If you have savings and decent credit, you buy something reliable. It costs more up front, less over time. If you don't, you buy what you can qualify for. Higher interest, older vehicle, more problems. Repairs stack up, payments don't stop. You're paying more for something that works less, and every month a little more money disappears just to keep the same unstable arrangement going. Rent works the same way. If you can afford to buy, your payment builds something: equity, stability, predictability. If you can't, you pay just as much, sometimes more, for something that builds nothing. You're paying for shelter, yes, but also for uncertainty, for the risk of rent increases, for the lack of control, for the fact that moving costs money you don't have. At some point, it starts to feel like you're renting more than just your apartment. You're renting peace of mind, you're renting flexibility, you're renting the ability to say no, and through all of this, people still say the same things. Just be more careful. Just plan ahead. Just save. As if planning magically creates money, as if caution eliminates emergencies, as if discipline alone explains why two people can make similar choices and end up with wildly different outcomes. Here's the part most advice skips over. When money is tight, it doesn't just limit what you can buy, it limits how far ahead you can think. Your mind gets crowded, not with ideas, with worries, rent, food, bills, deadlines. Your attention gets pulled toward what's urgent, not what's optimal. So when someone points at a decision and says, "That was a bad choice," they're missing the context. They're evaluating the choice from a place of safety, from distance, from a version of life where time, money, and margin exist. But when you're inside the situation, the choice doesn't feel like a choice. It feels like a reaction. And reactions are expensive. They're always expensive. What's unsettling is how consistently this shows up. Not once, not twice, but as a pattern that seems to punish the absence of margin itself. As if not having money carries its own hidden price tag. A surcharge, a premium, not for buying too much, but for buying while broke. And that raises a much bigger question. If this keeps happening across products, systems, and institutions, if the same math keeps showing up in different forms, then maybe the problem isn't the individual decisions. Maybe the cost isn't coming from what you're buying. Maybe it's coming from when you're forced to buy it. And why? So here's the uncomfortable thought to sit with. What if being broke isn't just hard? What if it's expensive by design? What if the moment you lose financial breathing room, the entire system quietly starts charging you extra? Not because you failed, but because you're vulnerable. And if that's true, then the real question isn't, how do I make more money? It's something far more unsettling. Why does the absence of money seem to multiply costs everywhere I turn? Let's slow down and look at what was really happening the whole time. Because nothing you heard in part one was accidental. Not the shoes, not the bank fees, not the car, not the rent. Those weren't separate problems. They were symptoms. They all came from the same invisible condition. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The problem isn't that things cost money. The problem is that timing costs money. When you have money, timing works in your favor. When you don't, timing turns against you. That's the hidden math. Think about the difference between buying something because it's time versus buying it because it's urgent. Urgency is expensive, always has been. When something breaks and you have cash, you fix it early, quietly, cheaply. When something breaks and you don't, you wait. Not because you want to, because waiting is the only option. And waiting changes the price. The small problem grows teeth. A leak becomes water damage. A warning light becomes a breakdown. A missed payment becomes a fee. Then interest, then penalties. What looks like punishment for bad choices is often just the price of being late. Not late, because you were careless. Late because you didn't have the buffer to act early. That buffer is the entire difference. And this is where the story usually goes wrong. Most advice jumps straight to solutions. Save more. Invest. Make your money work for you. But those ideas assume something quietly, dangerously important. They assume you already have margin. They assume you can choose when to act. But if you're living without margin, you're not making strategic decisions. You're making reactive ones. And reactive decisions are priced differently by the system. That's why interest works the way it does. People with money are rewarded for waiting. People without money are charged for urgency. That's not moral judgment. That's mechanics. Look at interest rates. If you're stable, interest is something you earn. If you're stretched, interest is something you pay. Same word. Opposite experience. Credit cards don't exist to help people who can't pay. They exist to monetize people who must pay later. Late fees aren't there to teach lessons. They're there because lateness is profitable. The system doesn't need you to fail completely. It just needs you to stay close to the edge. Close enough that timing mistakes keep happening. Close enough that urgency keeps showing up. That's the quiet loop. And once you're inside it, everything reinforces everything else. High rent makes saving harder. No savings makes emergencies worse. Emergencies create fees. Fees reduce cash. Reduced cash increases urgency. Around and around it goes. From the inside, it feels like exhaustion. From the outside, it gets labeled as irresponsibility. But now you can see the flaw in that story, because irresponsibility would look chaotic. This is structured, consistent, predictable, almost elegant in how repeatable it is. So where does that leave you? Here's the part that matters most. Escaping this isn't about getting rich. It's about changing the timing. Not forever, just enough to break the pattern. The moment you create even a small buffer, the math starts to shift. Not dramatically, quietly. Suddenly, problems stop escalating as fast. You can fix things early again. You can say now instead of later. You can absorb a surprise without borrowing. Against the future. That's why the first meaningful amount of savings feels so powerful. Not because it's a lot, but because it changes your position in time. You move from reacting to choosing. That's the real upgrade. It's not wealth, it's control over timing. And once timing changes, costs change. Interest rates drop. Fees disappear. Bulk pricing opens up. Repair costs shrink. The same world, different math. This is also why advice that skips this step feels insulting. Telling someone to invest while they're bleeding fees is like telling someone to train for a marathon while their shoes are falling apart. The first goal isn't speed. It's stopping the damage, stopping the unnecessary compounding, stopping the penalty for urgency. That's why the most important financial moves early on don't look impressive. They don't create stories. They don't feel like progress on paper. But they quietly eliminate entire categories of future costs. Fixing the thing early. Paying off the high-interest balance. Creating enough cash that a surprise stays small. Each one removes a multiplier. And that's the part most people miss. Poverty isn't just about low income. It's about high multipliers. Every mistake costs more. Every delay costs more. Every workaround costs more. When those multipliers disappear, the same income stretches further. Not because you changed who you are. Because you changed the math you're operating under. So if you've ever wondered why it feels like you're doing everything right and still falling behind, now you know where to look. Not at your effort, not at your discipline, but at your margin. Because margin is what determines whether time works for you or against you. Once you see that, the frustration starts to make sense. And when something finally makes sense, it loses some of its power over you. You stop blaming yourself for patterns you didn't design. You stop chasing advice that assumes a starting point you don't have yet. And you start focusing on the one thing that actually changes everything quietly. creating just enough space that urgency no longer controls the price. That's not flashy. It's not fast. But it works. And once it does, the world stops feeling like it's charging you extra just for existing. You're not ahead. You're not rich. You're just no longer paying the penalty for being late. And that difference changes everything. Quietly, honestly. For the first time in a long time, the math finally makes sense. There's a subtle shift that happens after you understand all this. Not relief, not motivation, something quieter. You start noticing how often urgency shows up in daily life. How many decisions are made because something can't wait? A bill, a repair, a deadline. Urgency doesn't announce itself loudly. It just nudges you. Now or never. Handle it or suffer later. And the longer you live without margin, the more normal that pressure feels. You stop questioning it. You adapt. But adaptation has a cost. When every choice feels time-sensitive, you lose the ability to step back. You don't shop for value. You shop for speed. You don't compare. You comply. And compliance is expensive. This is where the math becomes personal. Because once you recognize urgency as the real cost driver, you realize something important. You were never bad with money. You were reacting to time. That changes how you judge your past decisions. The bad choices weren't reckless. They were defensive. They were made inside a narrow window where waiting wasn't an option. That perspective matters because it removes shame. And when shame disappears, clarity shows up. You stop trying to overhaul your entire financial life. You stop chasing the perfect plan. Instead, your focus narrows. You start looking for places where urgency can be reduced, not eliminated, just softened. One bill that can be paid early. One repair that can be handled before it spreads. One small buffer that turns a crisis into an inconvenience. Each of these doesn't feel dramatic, but each one changes the math slightly. Urgency loses leverage. Fees disappear quietly. Interest stops compounding against you. And something else changes too. Your mind gets quieter. You don't think about money less because you have more of it. You think about it less because it stops ambushing you. That mental space is where better decisions come from. Not willpower, not discipline. Space. That's why people often look like they figured it out after a certain point. They didn't become smarter. They escaped urgency. Once that happens, everything downstream feels easier. Planning makes sense. Waiting becomes possible. Money stops feeling hostile. And when money stops feeling hostile, your relationship with it changes. You stop fighting it. You stop fearing it. You start using it. Calmly, deliberately. That's the quiet transformation most people miss. Not getting rich. Not winning. Just moving out of reaction mode, out of constant urgency, into a place where timing works with you instead of against you. That's when the pressure eases. That's when the numbers stop punishing you. And that's when progress finally feels real, not because life got easier, but because the math did.